When I was young, I had an Olympic dream. Unfortunately, I had absolutely no talent. Is this sounding familiar? So I made a plan. And that was to train in a sport that was so obscure that very few people were in it. Even less people had heard of it, and hardly anyone could pronounce it. That sport was luge. Now, for those of you who don't know luge, it's when you lie on a very tiny sled and you hurtle down an ice track feet first, wearing a helmet and a skin-tight bodysuit, no brakes, no padding. How obscure was this sport? At the time, there was only one track in the United States. There were about 40 Americans total doing it. About 10 were women. If 2 people go to the Olympics, then my chances were 1 in 5. And those were pretty good chances. So I traveled to the only luge track in the United States and began to learn the sport. And I was terrible at it. How terrible? Well, let's just say that I wanted a cool nickname like Sled Dog or Speedy. Instead, my nickname was Crash. Within a few weeks of being on the track, the national championships were held. And so, of course, I entered. Unfortunately, when it was my turn to race, I did what I always did. I crashed at the very big turn at the end. But the rules were that as long as you were touching your sled as you crossed the finish line, you weren't disqualified. So I managed to hang on with my fingertips and slide to a place in history. Now that place was last, but last here was number 11, and this was a national championship. So I got to proudly tell everyone and anyone who would listen that in the whole United States, I was in the top 11 of female lugers. So there are many, many lessons in this story, but I went on to apply one in particular to my writing life. In fact, I did this with many of my adventures. I learned something, often the hard way, and remembered that experience when I was writing books. Maybe because adventures are simply stories in action, and so they provided me with many of the tools that I use as an author. And I heard someone define a dramatic narrative as anticipation mingled with uncertainty. And that exactly describes adventure. That's what it feels like for me when I stand on the edge of a cliff about to launch my paraglider. That's what you guys felt when you launched your paragliders. So today I'm going to give you 3 of those tips that I learned through adventure that has been key for my writing, and I hope will be of use to your own creative experience. So, what I learned from luge: find your niche. Now, I know there are many important things to being a writer. Writing a beautiful sentence is the one most people think of. There's also finding a good story, knowing how to research, knowing how to interview. And frankly, I knew when I first started out, determined to publish a book, and I know now that there were so many amazing writers who can do all those things so much better than me. So I knew that my only chance at glory was not to compete with my fellow authors, but to find a place where no one else was, that only I could fill. In other words, I had to find the equivalent of the sport of luge, but in writing. So this is why my first published book was a memoir about being a firefighter. At the time, there were books out about firefighting, and some had been big bestsellers. But there were none from the perspective of a woman. And of course not, because back in 1998, when my memoir, Fighting Fire, was published, there were so few women firefighters. So if there were so few women firefighters, probably even less of them were writers, and I had my first book. And in fact, My publishing experience was a dream, and I sometimes hate to speak about it to new writers because it was unlike most people's experience of writing. I had a very few bad chapters written, and then I quickly found an agent. And I was told how to go through the process, and then I wrote a better version of those bad chapters, and that was quickly picked up by a New York publisher. And then I was heavily edited by a great editor, and with a lot of her help, I produced a pretty darn good book, and it got a lot of attention. And it wasn't because I was the best writer in the world. Not at all. It was because I had found a story that no one else could tell. I had broken the book into the book business by becoming the writer equivalent of being the number 11th loser in the world, in the country. I had found a space where few people were, and I had filled it. Now, it's not good enough to just find an obscure subject. Otherwise, your writer nickname will be Crash. In the end, I did not go to the Olympics in luge, and it wasn't because I wasn't good enough. It was ultimately because I wasn't interested enough. Within a year, I realized that I didn't want my life to be confined to an ice track. So just as I became a national team member of the United States, I quit. So make sure that you find that space to occupy that really resonates with you. And then hold on mightily with your fingertips until you cross the finish line. So my second tip, make sure you have good adventure buddies. So it's my first big fire as a San Francisco firefighter. I'm kneeling on the stairwell, and my heart is racing, and my breathing is shallow. And ahead of me, it's a thick wall of smoke. And below me, people are on the sidewalk, and they're crying, and they're screaming. And I've been only a few months on the job. And I'm what's called a probationer. And for short, they call us probies. But more often, they call us probie scum. And because I'm so new, I have an officer behind me, and he's also kneeling on the stairwell. And the two of us are about to head into the burning apartment. And back then, you had little actual schooling about fires. You just learned on the job. So it was part of the officer's responsibility to look out for the probie, and it on the job, in this case me, and to keep me from killing myself. And today my officer was a man named Lieutenant Calden. And I didn't know him very well, but he was a firefighter with experience of over 20 years. And right now, we are about to go into the biggest fire I have ever seen. And so I have to trust him. And now the smoke is coming up over us, and it's getting hot. And then Lieutenant Calden yells something at me. And I can't understand it because we both have air masks on, but I know it's important because, remember, I know nothing about firefighting, so whatever he's going to tell me has to be important. And I need to know what he's saying, so I yell back, what? And he yells something at me, and I still can't understand him. And then he turns around and goes back down the stairs. And he leaves me completely alone. And for a moment, I'm totally shocked. I mean, this doesn't make sense, even to someone like me. I know that the fire is ahead of us. So why did he leave? And it takes me a few seconds, and then I realize, oh, this is a test. He's trying to see whether I'll scream and cry and follow him out. Because you see, this is 1989. And all around the United States, women are just beginning to come into fire departments. And they're usually by court order. Here in the United States, I am the 15th female firefighter out of 1,500 men. Almost all those men are not happy that we women are there, and for many reasons, but the top one is they just don't believe that we're either strong enough or brave enough. So there's no way I'm going to look like a coward, nor am I going to fall for whatever dirty trick that my officer is now trying to play to prove that all women can't do this job. So I do what a firefighter is supposed to do. I plunge forward into the thick smoke and heavy heat, and I begin to crawl, dragging the hose. and I have no idea where I'm going. I don't know where the fire is. I don't know how to do this. I can't see anything. And this is the first surprise of a really good fire, what you guys would call a very bad fire. It's that it's totally pitch black. It's sort of like, what I tell people, it's like having a blanket wound around your head. And I start banging into things and swiveling the other way and banging, and it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And it seems to take years, but I'm sure it's only took a minute. And then I feel someone behind me, and he's pulling on my coat, and it's a hand on my shoulder. And this person, who, by the way, was not my officer, the guy who left me, pushed me very firmly through the dark, and pretty soon I could see flashes of orange, and I realized, oh, this must be flames, because it looks very different in a really, really bad fire. And then the guy behind me is yelling something, and I realize, finally, me, Proby scum, 15th woman in the fire department, future book writer, I open up the nozzle, and I pour water on the fire. So when the smoke cleared, my officer ran up to me, and he yelled at me. And it turns out he wasn't testing me. He was actually trying to tell me that he had forgotten his flashlight and was going down to retrieve it, and I was supposed to stay put. Now, to this day, I don't understand why he needed a flashlight. You could not see in this fire. You can't see in good fires. And I know that he panicked. But he also wasn't testing me. So the bottom line is, both of us were terrible adventure buddies. He abandoned me on the stairs, and I obviously didn't trust him to begin with, because my perspective was so colored by the stress of being one of the few female firefighters. And the only good adventure buddy was that guy in the dark who went to find me by following the hose, because he knew I was in there all alone. So suffice it to say that in my writing life, I have made sure that I have really good adventure buddies. Specifically, I belong to a writing community. And we call ourselves the Grotto. And without the Grotto, I can honestly tell you that I would not have published any of the 4 books that I have published today. As many of us know, the writing life is dark. There's lots of bumping into walls and losing your way. And many, many people will not believe in you. But the Grotto has never once left me on the stairs and has often accompanied me all the way through the smoke to the fire. So I want to describe the Grotto to you. I don't think you have a community like this here, and I think I would love to see a Romanian grotto. Grotto means cave. I looked up the word grotta. I would love to see a grotta here in Romania. So let me explain it to you. In 1994, about 20 years ago, 3 writers decided that they were just tired of writing in their own homes, in their pajamas, while their friends went off to work. And so they rented a 6-room apartment in San Francisco to use exclusively as workspace, and they called it the Grotto. And at this time, this is 20 years ago, this was a totally unique idea, a shared workspace for self-employed writers. So the 3 founders, Ethan, Poe, and Ethan Kanan, Poe Bronson, and Ethan Waters, maybe you've heard of them. They're all very renowned writers in the United States, but they weren't at the time. They worried that there would be extra rooms they couldn't fill, but in fact, writers flocked to this idea. It started out with 6 people, and today, over 20 years later, we have 80 people in our current writer space. And at first glance, the Grotto just looks like office space. There's a common kitchen and a large lunchroom, and we have a library where people can hold meetings, and there are bookshelves on which some of the 100 or so books that have been published at the Grotto reside. But the Grotto is more than just desks, because the thing about being a writer in the United States is we all know that we can write for free at home or at a cafe. And yet we are willing to pay rent in order to be in proximity with other writers, because As I have found at the Grotto, there is a great power in a group of narrative artists. And some of it's practical power, and some of it seems quite magical. So on the practical side, when you get a group of people together, and Wendy touched on this yesterday on collaboration, but we share information about our trade. At the Grotto, we have a common email list. We ask questions about advances, about difficult editors. We've formed groups within the Grotto, those 80 people that meet in person depending on what the issues are. So you'll have journalists that get together to learn how to do pitch sessions. Currently, we have 6 people about to publish books, so they all got together so they could help each other do marketing. But so the Grotto is more than just office space, and it's more than what we call in San Francisco co-working space. Do you guys have that here? So co-working space, you guys have the hub here, right? I love the hub. We have it in San Francisco too. But the hub is all about having a place to work. And then I think you do interact with people. Do you bring speakers in as a group? That's great, yep. But I would say that the Grotto goes one step further, and it's really a community. And here's the thing about large groups, and having been a minority in the fire department, I'm wary of large groups because, you know, they can splinter off into distinct tribes. A majority can bully a minority, or they can fall under the sway of just one personality. And it's enough of a risk that many of us might decide, oh, I don't want to belong to a group of people because we don't want anything to get in the way of our creativity. And what can create more of a mess than human relationships? But the thing about the Grotto is that we've avoided that, and we're 80 people now, and I think the reason we've avoided that is because we have one strong belief. It's the certainty that there is enough out there for everyone. We call it we say a rising tide lifts all boats. Do you guys know what that is? The idea that if I support somebody else, that helps me. That there's enough out there for everyone. So the Grotto has purposely laid down a culture that on subtle and not so subtle levels, we discourage competition with one another. And though, of course, we're human and you can feel envious or you can feel mad at yourself for failing, we don't talk about it in the halls. It's really frowned upon to talk badly about anybody else at the Grotto. And this is why I believe the writers in the Grotto flourish. We have an unusual amount of successful writers, people that start out not successful. When we started out, 6 of the 9 writers when I joined, 5 of us have New York Times bestsellers. Those kind of numbers for anybody who understands writing is kind of unbelievable, and I believe that it was the power of the group that made that happen. So Mary Roach, do you guys know who Mary Roach is? She's a best-selling author, was a Grotto member, and she said, writers start out like raw meat. They need to marinate. I became the author I am by soaking in the talent, passion, and affection of the people at the Grotto. And she's right. I think marination is a really good word for it because when you're around all these other people who are writing books, plays, screenplays, articles, you realize what's possible for you. So, and it was a fellow Grotto writer who said to me, Caroline, girls need to hear about the adventures you have. And it seems obvious now, but I never would have thought of it if she hadn't told me. And I once people come to us a lot and ask us, how can we start a Grotto-like community? And so we do offer advice on how to do that. And one woman came up to me and said that she wanted to start one in Chicago, and she wanted to get, every creative art under one roof. And I actually suggested to her that you not do that, that you find people with the same narrative vision. So storytellers if you're going to start a grotto, because in that way you can all help each other. There's a certain energy, I think. There's an interchange of ideas and inspiration when you're all sort of basically heading towards the same fire. At the grotto, the only real sort of qualification is to be published in your field. And the idea is to have enough of a background that everybody can help each other. So I'd love to see some kind of grotto-like writing community start here. I think it would be, I mean, maybe it doesn't work in Romania like it works in the United States. But the ones that have cropped up in the United States have produced an unlikely amount of very successful writers. So one last lesson from my adventures, and it's a pretty obvious one. It's resilience. And that's the ability to pick yourself up after a failure and go forward. So by 2008, I had published 2 books. And this was a pretty good feat. It was nothing spectacular, but it was cool. It was pretty cool. And I was finishing 2 new novels. Combined, they had taken me about 4 years. That's 4 years of going into the grotto and writing. And then finally, the first of these 2 books was ready to make the rounds of the publishing houses. And I couldn't sell it. I was devastated. 15 publishers rejected it. And I wondered if I should just quit writing. I wept in the hallways of the grotto. And the writers rallied around me and they said, "Hey, Caroline, you got another book. What about that other book?" But before I had a chance to do that one, I crashed my experimental plane and I almost killed myself. For those of you who don't know what an experimental plane is, it's a hang glider with a lawnmower underneath it. So I was confined to my sofa for months with injuries. And all in all, it took about a year to recover. And I was lucky enough to have just met my now fiancée, Wendy. And for some reason, instead of realizing this was not what she bargained for and leaving, she decided to stay and take care of me. But she was in for a lot. In that year, I became crazy. And as some of you know, I decided that, among other things, it was imperative that I find out where my cat was going when he went outside. And since I was so badly injured, I couldn't follow him, so I first used GPS, and then a small camera on his collar, and then a video camera. And I even went to animal communications class to see if he would talk to me. Meanwhile, I was physically on the mend, so I finished the second novel and I sent that out. And it too was rejected by 15 publishers. And I said again, I'm quitting. I can't spend 5 years of my life on something that doesn't go anywhere. It's just not possible financially, emotionally. And again, I wept in the hallways of the grotto. And again, they propped me up. And Wendy said she believed in me. She said, "You'll think of something." And so I guess it was with the same resilience that got me crawling 8.5 miles and kept me crashing at every turn and yet getting on the U.S. luge national team anyway, that I kept writing. And this time I decided it would be a nonfiction book. It only requires a proposal. And so I would try yet again. So I sent that out. And you guessed it, 15 publishers rejected it. Now, I felt only slightly better about this third punch in the gut because it only took 3 months to write a proposal instead of the 5 years that I had spent on the other 2 books. But it was another rejection. And I told Wendy, look, I'm done. I have to find another career. But there was one glimmer of hope in me. There was still a little bit of resilience because I had already published 2 books. So I knew I could do it. I do know a lot of people their rejections happen at the very beginning of their career. And that is the hardest. I think if that had happened, I probably would have given up writing. But I was lucky. I had 2 books behind me. So meanwhile, I'd been telling acquaintances and strangers about the year of my crash and recovery, and the eyes of people all over San Francisco were glazing over with boredom as I explained, with the evangelism of anybody who thinks that their private agony is a riveting story, about the intense depression that comes with bad injury. But when I mentioned that during this intense depression, I had stalked my cat using a variety of technologies, I noticed that their eyes lit up. So it took me a while, but I saw that that was the book I had to write. And it got published. And it was published in 10 languages, including Romanian, as some of you know. And that proves to me that resilience is worth it. And now I have another book called, as you know, The Gutsy Girl. And that too is in Romanian. And so thank you, Black Button Books, because it's been a long, hard road. So to that end, I want to say that I'm sure in my future there's a new round of rejected books and proposals. And when that happens, I'll weep in the hallways. I'll tell Wendy that I'm done with writing. And then I'll do what successful writers and adventurers all over the world do. I'll find a new niche to fill. I'll muster the support of my adventure buddies. I'll call upon my resilience, and I'll keep writing. Thank you.